So the topic.
Live streaming is on.
Live streaming is on. Okay, I'm going to start again. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tor's very first PrivChat. And we've got an interesting set of people today and hopefully an interesting set of topics that we can work through. So the very first PrivChat that we're doing, we started off thinking about COVID tracing and COVID app tracing and privacy of it. And then all the protests started happening around the world and around the country. And we realized that we should figure out the combination of these, that we should explore the privacy of protests and the privacy of how the COVID tracing fits into them. So we've got three panelists today. We've got Carmela Troncoso, who's a professor at EPFL in Switzerland. We've got Daniel Gilmore, who you may know as DKG, who fights the good fight in ACLU land. And we've got Matt Mitchell, who's famous for the crypto Harlem, teaching people who really need to know about security, how security works. And we've got me, Roger Dingledine, the Tor founder, and I wear other hats besides that. So why is this a Tor topic? The easy answer is privacy is about choice. Privacy is about control. Privacy is about understanding what the threats are and what you can do about them. So thinking through the COVID tracing app privacy questions is what choices do people want to be able to make in those situations, and you need to know what the trade-offs are for that. So before we begin, I'm going to start off by saying if you enjoy this PrivChat, or if you like Tor, please consider becoming a monthly donor for Tor. Reliable gifts are really important to us. First of all, they help us remain stable, and they come in every month, which is the best way to do it is to be a monthly donor. If you go to donate.torproject.org, then there's a lot more information there. And another key piece of that is the unrestricted funding from donations gives us the flexibility to actually work on the projects that are most important to work on. And I should point out, if you become a monthly donor, that category of donor we call Defenders of Privacy, and we've got a cool physical object Defenders of Privacy patch that we will send to you if you become a monthly donor. Okay, so with that said, we want your questions. You can add them on YouTube chat, and we'll get to them, or you can Twitter them to us to @Tor Project, and we've got some people reading over them, and we'll pick some questions and read them out. Also, the hashtag PrivChatWithTor will also hopefully get to us. Okay, so far so good. With that in mind, I'm going to start us off. So let's start on the COVID app tracing side. Carmela, you're the expert on this one. Can you start us off with a couple-minute summary of what are the options for COVID tracing and how do they compare? And you are muted.
One for me. So the idea of tracing didn't start with the apps. The idea of tracing is quite old. It came with other diseases like Ebola or HIV. And the idea is that once you are infected with one of these diseases, somebody will ask you, who were you in contact with, to try to find out who could have been infected, to inform them of the risk so that they can take precautions, and as such break what is called the infection chain. So what happened with COVID is that because of the volume at the speed as which COVID transmits, the traditional way of doing this manually with a person that actually calls you and talks to you has become non-scalable. Each of these interviews takes a couple of hours. You need a person to do it. And on top of that, it relies on human memory. And we don't remember everybody that we saw, nor we know everybody that we have been very close with, like people on the metro or on the supermarket line. So with this idea, when it kind of became clear that we were not able to contain the COVID breakouts, the idea was that can we use technology in a way to complement this? And what these apps try to do is to actually help in contact tracing by being able to maybe find contacts that you would not find in these interviews, and also to be able to do this notification in a very fast way, as opposed to having to wait for your turn for the interview and then for your turn to be called, so that infection chains can be cut very fast. So that would be kind of the difference between these two. Do you want me to elaborate more now within the apps?
Sure, sounds good.
So the first apps that appeared were GPS based, and the idea was that you would trace people, and then you would just either publish the locations of these people so that others could check, have I been there at that time, or you would upload all of the traces of other people to just check which the people were in the same place. So besides the obvious horrible privacy implications of this, it also does not work from the contact tracing point of view, because GPS is not precise enough. Right? We need to know if we are in the kind of a 1.5, 2.5 meters, and the error of GPS is already bigger than that. And it does not work indoors, which is the place where most of the infections actually happen. When we're outdoors, this thing is more difficult to transmit. So with that also, and with the privacy concerns, came the idea of using Bluetooth. Using Bluetooth as a proximity technology. And Bluetooth has the advantage, does not rely on location, which is nice from a privacy perspective, and that enables to some extent, estimate when people are close or far away. And by now we know that this 1.5, 2.5 meters, we can do quite well, to be fair. So now the question is, how do we use this Bluetooth? And how most of these apps works, the idea is the app would be broadcasting a random pseudo identifier, like a random number all the time. And this random number could be rotating. And when you find another app, this other app will listen to you. And then both of you will actually kind of record the numbers that you have seen. So at the end of a period, you have two lists on your phone. One of them are the numbers that you broadcasted, and the other one is the number that you have seen. And there is where the next division between apps happen. So now, in order to find matches, we can do two things. One, which is called the centralized version, is when I'm infected, I take the list of observed identifiers and I send them to a server. And then this server has the capability of mapping each of these identifiers to a person. And if the server computes that I have been for long enough with this person for the exposure to the virus to be problematic, this person would get notified. So that means that I'm uploading all of the people that I have been seen at that point in a pseudonymized way. But when it gets up, the server has to notify them. And here is where we see that probably the server can make the mapping one way or another, because otherwise cannot receive the notification. The other version, which is the one that I have been working for the last months, is the one in which what I upload to the server is the ones that identifies that I have been broadcasted. So that means that I don't upload information about any other people that I have seen, which is nicer from a privacy perspective. And then what happens is that the other phones download periodically the list of all of the infected identifiers and check locally whether they have been exposed for long enough. If long enough has happened, then they would locally show up a notification, and this person is prompted to, in the case of Switzerland, call an info line, but different countries have different policies. So the difference here at the end of the day is what information goes to this server and how much trust do we have to put in this server.
Okay, so I guess the first piece of that is this is a great example of a privacy enhancing technology design where one option is to centralize the approach, where you're trusting a central party to keep people safe and to behave correctly and to choose not to reconstruct the social graph. When it can, it just promises it won't. And the other option is an approach where each individual can decide for themselves what they want to learn and what they want to share with other people. So what countries are doing it right? What countries are doing it wrong? How far are people in deployment? Like, is this app thing a thing that I can download and use now?
Not in the US, as far as I know. Maybe Daniel can speak a bit more about that. In Europe, currently, we have the app completely deployed in Germany and in Italy. Switzerland is having the official launch this Thursday. And a couple of other countries are also announcing their pilots, and all of this is on the decentralized mode. And then we have France that follows the centralized mode. We also had Norway and the UK that had started in a centralized way, but both of them stopped. And the case of Norway, because the Data Protection Authority stopped them, said that the collection of data was non-proportional for what the application was doing. In the case of the UK, they decided to stop themselves because the thing when you do this at the centralized, so when you want to send this in, you cannot use the native libraries that Google and Apple have developed. And that means that you lose all of the advantages of the operative system. And then these apps, to be fair, don't work very well in the sense that Androids don't see iPhones, they sometimes don't see other Androids, you consume much more battery. So this becomes very complicated.
Tell us more about the Google-Apple situation, because at first everybody was like, oh my God, Google and Apple are going to spy on everybody. And then it turns out all they did was change their operating system so other people can write the apps. Who actually writes these apps? Is this governments? Is it researchers? Is it individuals?
In general, in Europe at least, all of these apps have been commissioned by governments. The idea that Google and Apple have is that only what they call entitled apps will have access to this exposure notification API. To have an entitlement, you need to be an official health organization, whether it is national or regional, or in the case of the United States, they get federal or from the state, or even more local. It is not very clear exactly what's going to be the criteria. And indeed, Google and Apple is kind of take a type of protocol that we were designing and put it in on their operative system, kind of closing the option that you could do the centralized option, because you cannot really observe these beacons. What it means beyond that is actually to be seen. So far, it is in that sense nice. They have made a battery efficient system that actually enables this particular app to work. Now, what else they will do now that they took control over that? Now it's very hard to predict the future, and that's something that I believe as a privacy community we should be taking a close look at and have a lot of pressure on them so that what they did that seems nice stays nice.
Sounds good. So another thing that I've been wondering, there's like manual contact tracing and there's the COVID tracing apps. You argued that the tracing apps are going to scale better and work better in theory. Is there evidence that they work better in practice? Do you need some critical mass of people installing the app before it matters? What sort of critical mass is enough?
The first thing is that they must work together. So a COVID tracing app is not going to substitute the need for manual contact traces because there are people that don't have apps. There are also contacts that maybe the app misses. Like if we really want to stop the pandemic, like you need to do both, right? This is not a saving cost. This is a saving lives and try to expand. To the question, is there evidence? No, there is no evidence because so far each of these apps have been deployed for a week. So it's very, very hard to say. And the last question was how many people? So there was a study from the University of Oxford that said 60% of the population is to use it. And in the beginning, everybody was very freaked out about this. But first of all, this study is a research study. It's kind of the round chicken study in which if the wall was like this and like that, then you need 60%. Now, in reality, life is very different. It's not the same. The center of a city where probably you would need a lot of people, different than the rural, well, less people would actually give you the same of coverage. But at the end of the day, when we talk with epidemiologists, they say the more people, the better. And at the end of the day, the goal is to keep the R0 factor, reproduction factor of the disease under 1. So it's not about coverage, but about having the right people. If you just are lucky or you have the concrete places, like places where there would be like people that take the metro a lot or things like that, you may be as good, even if you only have a 30%, than a 60%, but they are distributed in any other way. So it is hard to say. So far, we at least here to use it, because the more likelihood we have to actually cut the transmission chains.
Is anybody talking about making it mandatory or forcing people or saying you can't go to a place without a phone with this app installed, or is this all like social pressure?
Yes, no? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So about voluntary and mandatory. So the European law, the European Commission has said that these apps should not be mandatory. It's not a law, it's kind of a recommendation. Now, all of the countries so far have gone for voluntary. And more importantly, some of the countries, at least in Switzerland, the law has changed to accompany the launch of the app, to, for instance, put in the law that discrimination on the basis of the use of the app is not allowed. So I cannot be denied entrance on a restaurant because I don't use the app. And they also made sure that all the discrimination laws apply in the case of the workplace, so that my employer cannot put pressure on me to have the app or fire me because I don't want to use it. Or actually even more fun, I have heard that in some places, actually bosses are worried about the contrary. The fact that people may actually use the app and therefore they may receive notifications and have to be quarantined and put pressure on people to not use the app. I would love to hear if somebody has heard more about this. We're losing panelists. Is it only me? Or did you also see? Hey, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Please continue where you were.
And I was just saying that that in Europe, they're voluntary, and we're putting a lot of I mean, it worked in Switzerland that we have laws to prevent discrimination, but this is something very, very important as well. Governments are deploying a new technology, and it has to come with the adequate social legal support, such as laws for non-discrimination, support in the case of quarantine, so laws that, of course, prevent that you get if you have to go in quarantine because the app notifies you, compensation in case like a sick leave, the same kind of things. Because if none of this works, of course, nobody would install the app, right? Why would I install the app if I'm going to lose my job and cannot work anymore? These kind of things. And in the sense, I don't know, I guess there's a huge difference again between Europe and the US in terms of culture and social protections.
Yeah, that's an interesting balance of we need to make it socially required, but maybe not legally required, and how that works in each jurisdiction is going to be an interesting thing to see. Okay, so let's switch over to our other topic, which is the protest side of things, and figure out what that is, and then let's tie them together. So step one, can one of you, maybe Daniel or Matt, explain what's going on in the US and why now? Like, what events and circumstances in America led to, we used to be saying you have to social distance, and now we're all saying, okay, it's time to be in the streets. That was a sudden shift. What happened?
I'll take it first. Is that cool, Daniel?
Sure.
I want to say that there was the shooting death of unarmed Black folks, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. George Floyd's death was captured on mobile phone and spread across media and became international quite quickly, went viral. And I think at that moment, people were just like, you know what, I'm sick of it. And I'm taking, like, me having Black skin, my life, I'm just taking, I walk a step down the street, I go to the store, I go back to my home, you know, that could be life-threatening, that existence. Probably more life-threatening than COVID, because I can prevent COVID, right? I can't prevent being shot by police in the United States. So I think the protest really galvanized people who were at home, following these restrictions and rules. And as of June 17th, I read in Slate that said that the numbers have not peaked in the cities where the protest started. specifically in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, where protests were happening from the day of, right? And I know that I'm involved with a group called the Movement for Black Lives. And this weekend, for Juneteenth weekend, we had a protest organized all around the United States. And, you know, our organizers made sure that folks had COVID testing capability. So everyone who was traveling was getting tested for COVID. Everyone was negative. We had masks, props to Signal for assisting with some masks. And we had a lot of PPE, and everyone so far is being as careful as possible while fighting for our rights. What do you think, DKG?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back some towards, I think, what Roger mentioned earlier, where privacy, you know, this idea that privacy is about choice, right? These are decisions people are making. Nothing is going to be risk-free, and not acting at a moment when we have a real potential for positive change in this country, for long overdue, not just a conversation, but actual action to address serious racial injustice in this country. That itself is a risk. And, you know, so what I see with these protests is I see people coming out and saying, you know, enough is enough. You know, we are willing to commit to taking risks. We're taking economic risks just by staying home for COVID, and we're going to take risks by being out on the street in order to push back against racial injustice. Now, we don't need to take unnecessary risks. We want to take measured risks. And so, like Matt said, the protests that I've been to, the folks that I've seen, have been careful and cautious, while at the same time being willing to step out and say, look, I'm going to put myself on the line for these issues that I care about, for these issues that matter to us. And I think you'll see, I mean, we can talk more about the connection between these protests and COVID, but I think what you see people's willingness to step up and self-sacrifice to keep their community safe. And I think you see that in both of these circumstances, right? People are willing to say, you know, I'm going to not spend some time with my friends that I would otherwise like to do because I want to keep them safe. This is a community defense project. And similarly, stepping out into the street and protesting this is also community defense. Even for those of us who aren't necessarily targeted directly for the color of our skin, that my community includes people who are, and the injustice itself is unacceptable. So you know, you see people stepping out and taking these actions, and I think what you're seeing is people are realizing that as a collective, as a society, our decisions impact other people, right? And that's sort of a lesson for me from years of working on internet privacy concerns and other similar tools, is that these decisions that we make about what we're going to do actually don't just have an impact on ourselves. I think as a privacy community, we have a history of talking about, oh, they could be coming after your data. And I think that's a mistake. I think what we're seeing here is a realization that this collective action is really what's necessary to make the changes happen that we want to see happen. And I also think that it's interesting to see with this COVID situation, with the kinds of tracing apps that Carmela was talking about, the privacy that these systems afford is actually closely related to their utility in the community defense that they offer. Right? If the apps are developed, if the monitoring systems, if people don't trust them, then they will inevitably shirk them, right? Anybody can leave their phone at home. You can turn things off. You can build yourself a Faraday bag to stuff your phone into. You can avoid being tracked if you feel threatened by it. And yet these systems for the disease surveillance are intended to actually try to help keep the community safe. So if they're not seen as privacy preserving, they're actually not going to perform the same function that we want them to perform.
In terms of why now, another angle that I find interesting, the impact of the COVID pandemic has been lopsided in America and probably around the world in terms of much more affecting certain communities than others, and that really ties into this. Can one of you explain that and talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I'm in New York, and New York is like, although Brazil is quickly gaining, New York is the hotspot globally for the pandemic. And when you look at New York, you find that the state of New York City is more the hotspot, and then the Bronx is more the hotspot in New York City, right? And that is a community of Black and brown folks, and it's a community that's really under siege by COVID-19. So when we look at the numbers, we hear these numbers are really high, but when we examine that and interrogate that, what we see is that in places where people have less money, in places where people have less privilege, in places where people cannot travel to their summer homes, places where people are mostly the folks who are those working at your grocery store or at your retailer that was open, right? That's the people who pay the price, and that's Black and brown folks in New York City. So I think if you're like, hey, I'm forced because I need to, buy diapers and groceries and pay my rent, and because I'm on the front lines because I work at a grocery store or a retailer or a delivery person, I'm forced to put my life at risk, and then I'm not going to risk going out and having an immune response for my community, defending my community and protecting myself from law enforcement and other threats. So I think that it just makes sense, and I think that there's a racial angle to this as well. Is that most people who died of COVID, when you're looking at the people who died, Black folks are dying twice as fast of COVID-19. So we see that not only are these communities under siege, but they're also the ones paying the price more than others. So why not, at this point, protest and do something that you can to save your generation behind you, your civilization that you have while you're still breathing?
On top of that, I think you see the policing forms, right? I mean, many of these protests are specifically focused on racial injustice in policing, although they have expanded to look at the broader scope of racial injustices in our society generally, right? More Black and brown folks are dying of COVID-19, not because Black and brown folks are inherently more susceptible, but because our social support structures are themselves racist, right? And so people will get more support the more privilege that they have. But if you tie it back to policing, you can see the same effect in policing. So it's just really this magnification of what's happening, right? The social distancing orders, oh, you're supposed to be wearing a mask, you're supposed to be keeping distance from people. How are those actually enforced? The police have been enforcing those discriminatorily, as they have almost every other law, against Black and brown folks, right? The people who get thrown to the ground and tackled for violating social distancing orders tend to be Black and brown folks. The people who are held in a cell for minor infractions with no protective equipment in close proximity to other people tend to be Black and brown folks. So you see this combination of the racial injustice in the policing and the racial injustice in the society's response to the pandemic. You can't untangle these things because it's so deeply woven into the fabric of society.
And that also ties into the community trust side of things, where maybe in an ideal world, our police are people who actually come in and help us. But especially in the areas most hit by COVID, the police are folks who come in and kill them, which is exactly not what you want in a government group that you're supposed to be trusting. So yeah, this ties into the institutionalized police racism. Daniel, did you want to talk more about the stop and frisk and felons can't vote and all the other imbalances that we see?
Sure. So I live in New York City, and one of the ongoing discussions we've had about racist policing in the city has centered around stop and frisk for many years. Stop and frisk was a policy that the New York Police Department and many other police departments have done, where they would routinely stop people that they considered to be suspicious, which was, again, disproportionately Black and brown, typically men, and search them and then send them on their way. These things didn't result in many arrests, but it was just a routine low level of harassment. And it could, for some people, result in being picked up on charges. It's one of the reasons why people have been, African Americans are much more likely to be to have dealt with the justice system around marijuana offenses, for example, than white folks, despite the fact that everybody uses marijuana at about the same rates. So these are just examples of what was wrong with stop and frisk. And in New York City, we won some judgments against the New York City Police Department after demonstrating that stop and frisk was racially discriminatory and improper. What the police department did with that injunction was to dismantle their stop and frisk program and turn instead towards other types of community surveillance, once again targeted at the same communities. And that includes the gang databases, where they have lists of people with vague gang associations, which themselves can turn around and make a person more susceptible to targeting and police harassment. It turned into like Facebook units, where officers would go online, pretend to be someone else, and try to convince people to announce that they had dealt drugs or try to entrap people in conversations in the online community. So forms of infiltration and surveillance that were done digitally, electronically, once stopping people directly on the street had been ruled out. And so you see these patterns of abuse that are replicated into the online world. And so, one of the conversations that we're having right now is how do we rein in these powers, right? And this is similar to the sorts of questions that Carmela was raising in asking, if you're going to build a surveillance app that's supposed to keep society safe from this pandemic, how do you do it so that the centralized powers themselves don't have an authority, enough power to do things that you didn't want them to do? And so you can't just staff up the police. We spend $6 billion every year on the police here in New York City, more than the budget of most national militaries. You can't just throw that kind of money into an organization and expect it to somehow be properly restrained. You have to institute restraints. And so there's questions about how do we do that? And one of the things that we're working on now, in addition to actually pulling some of that money and funding back from the police, is directly trying to account for police surveillance technology. Much of the police surveillance technology is secretive. It's secretive in ways that, like, the police don't want to talk about it. If it gets introduced in court, sometimes they will actually drop prosecutions rather than expose what types of surveillance they're using. Some of it is funded in really shady ways, not allocated from the city budget. And so we have been introducing in municipalities around the US and in other cities around other countries as well, ordinances that require that the police budget, as it pertains to surveillance technologies, needs to be publicly documented and subject to citizen review. So we had a big win on that just recently in New York City. And we hope to see, and we've had, over several years, we've had ongoing series of victories in this, and we hope to see that expand more nationally. Providing those kinds of checks and balances towards centralized power gives us, is like, those are some of the things that we have to do in addition to the other sorts of sort of physical protections for the neighborhood and communities that we care about.
So we started this talking about COVID tracing apps and whether you trust your government and you trust your government organizations to keep you safe and to keep your data safe. And now we're talking about the overreach and overrun of police brutality, which are supposed to be the government organizations that keep us safe, and people are out protesting, risking the COVID safety in order to highlight the fact that these systems that are supposed to serve us have broken down. So, I mean, that's where the defund the police program is going. And I mean, we can talk about the militarization of police. We can talk about how things are unbalanced, where they protect themselves, and the governments and the laws and the whole system is designed to maintain itself against us. Does anybody have any thoughts on that, or should we leave those topics hanging?
Well, I would just quickly say, like Daniel was saying earlier, we have the public oversight of surveillance technology, that recent law that basically says in 6 months, the NYPD needs to explain to us what technology they've been using to surveil us, right? And I say us, I mean all New Yorkers, but specifically Black and brown folks, and specifically people in the inner city like Harlem and East New York, Brownsville, the Bronx, those communities. And what we know so far, and what we always know is just from accidents, just like things being uncovered, right? That there's, we can visibly see these towers with cameras in them, but exactly what sensors they have on them, we'll finally find out, right? We can visibly see cameras in the light poles. So, but why are they there? What are they used for? Now we can find out, right? We've heard about these X-ray vans that can see through the walls, but I guess that's what happens when you have $6 billion, you start doing crazy Star Wars type stuff. We can figure out exactly how much they're being used, and this stuff it doesn't make any sense. We've microphones on our rooftops, microphones on our shot spotter systems in our city. We've got cameras in our city. And if there is a correlation truly to these things assisting the public, helping in public safety, lowering crime in these neighborhoods, we finally can get to see it, because we finally will have to find out where these things are, how they're used, for what use, etc. And I think that's a big win. And I remember like 3 years ago, I was working with Chad Marlowe, ACLU, about this stuff. It was called CCOPS, Community Control Over Police Surveillance. And it's something that all of you listening should be pushing for, no matter where in the world you live, to just find out, look, fingerprint technology, we understand what it is, we understand how it's used, we understand who it's used against, and it doesn't stop the effectiveness of fingerprint technology working to find people who are doing bad things. So, but with surveillance technology, it's all done in secret, and that day's coming to an end. Oh, they're coming for me.
Let's talk more about budgets for police. because so Daniel talked about the $6 billion, and there's an interesting pie chart that I saw from the Los Angeles city budget, where out of their like active funding, more than half of it is going to pay the LAPD. That is incredible. I mean, they're handing all of the governmental responsibilities to the police department. You need to get a cat out of the tree, call the police. You need to help a person, get down their stairs, call the police. You need to find help somebody with their drug problem, call the police. So part of the goal of the defund the police program is to change the social safety net structure so that there are other pieces, like send a dude with a gun cannot be the answer to most of the problems. Is there,
right.
I mean, how do we fix the budget problem?
And that doesn't even include the millions of dollars that are paid in civil lawsuits against the police for things that go wrong. So, I mean, I think that the solution is, working within the communities that we already have social workers. We also have mental health experts. We have people who de-escalate, right? People who are not armed, people who are not trained to arrest. That's not the goal, isn't getting collars, right? The goal is to assist and help people. And there will be and I think when people hear defund, they think, okay, what to what end? And I'm like, look, if you can take $1 billion out of that budget in, let's say, New York to $5 billion, or a couple million out of that budget to LA, let's see where that goes. Maybe that lowers numbers to the point where we can say policing is obsolete. We're fine now, right? Let's look at the cost and the benefits of this thing and figure out something that makes sense.
Sounds good. So let's try to tie these two pieces together, the COVID tracing app side and the protesting side. So the obvious connection is bringing a social graph mapping app to your protest is exactly what you don't want to bring. It's exactly the opposite of what you want to be bringing to your friends who are trying to change society. So I guess one question, there's worries about surveillance from COVID tracing apps, and there's worries about surveillance from other things. Like they go read your Facebook accounts. There's that helicopter in the sky that we don't really know what it's looking at, but maybe it's doing facial recognition or anything. There are the cameras you talked about. So, and there are other issues besides surveillance, like they send undercover people to go pretend to be protesters and to infiltrate and to learn what your plans are and to undermine and destroy the unity and cohesion. So how do we balance these things? I mean, one option is all the other stuff is way worse than COVID tracing privacy, so don't worry about it. And the other answer is every new angle of surveillance adds to the other ones and magnifies the problems. How should we be thinking about this?
I think we should be focused on, I'll just answer really quickly, on safety and care and love for your neighbor. And I think that's the benefit of these. There's a way that you can use technology to track things in a decentralized way that cares about people's privacy and trust and is transparent, right? And I think that's the same thing when it comes to these protests. There's ways to go about it. Like most people I see in protests have masks on, are really trying to social distance as much as they can. And everyone's looking out for the person next to them. And I think it's about that trust and that care.
I'll pause for the other participants to jump in.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a bunch of ways to look at the intersection between these concerns, right? So, and it really does get down to the nitty-gritty details. Carmela is described at the start of this conversation a sort of spectrum of types of applications that you could use to do contact tracing or exposure notification in a digital sense that will be an augment to manual contact tracing, right? And manual contact itself exposes a range of additional privacy concerns, right? Manual contact tracing literally is a person from the government coming to you and saying, who were you spending time with? I'm going to go contact them and talk to them if you're sick. And if you aren't sick, but maybe you were exposed, it means a call from someone from the government who says, I can't tell you who said this, but we think you've been exposed. You should come in for testing, right? So again, there's this overall question of social trust, but there's also these questions of, what concretely is going to happen. And I think if you look at the technical proposals that Carmela described, you see some really interesting trade-offs. Singapore took what Carmela described as the centralized approach, where if you're sick, your device uploads a list of identifiers that it saw, and some central authority can unpack those identifiers and figure out how to contact them on your behalf, supposedly, or on behalf of society. But that central authority gets information about that. Now, that's better than, say, a system where everyone's phone constantly checks in with the central authority and says, I'm at this location at this time, and here's who I see next to me, right? That would be even more centralized, large data grab. But it's still a situation where anybody who has access to the ability to do that transformation from encrypted identifier to person's contact information can just set up a Bluetooth listener. A Bluetooth listener just means a radio, right, that can listen with certain set of protocols and rules. They can record those things, and if they can transform those identifiers into meaningful connections to people, they can build that location graph, they can build that social graph anywhere that they have those listeners set up. This goes back again to what Matt described, which is, we've got radio towers, we've got boxes with radios and cameras and other things we don't know what in them in our neighborhoods, right? I can see one on the telephone pole right outside my door. What's in there? Is there a radio listener? Is there a Bluetooth listener there that would be gathering this stuff? If you go with the centralized model that Singapore has, and the police can gather those signals, and they take those signals, and then they were to have the ability to decrypt them to a specific identifier, that gives them a tremendous amount of information without needing to go through the sort of AI shenanigans around facial recognition, which itself is a whole other kettle of fish, right? These things do build on each other. And if you can say, oh, we got a facial recognition hit and we got an identifier from the COVID tracing app, and that's why we're going to go arrest this person, that's potentially more of that's a more troubling centralization of power. If, on the other hand, you take digital protocols that are less centralized, like the ones that Carmela has worked on, then the information that's available to someone who operates a sensor network like that is significantly less, to the point where it may not be worth it to deploy the sensor network, right? It may not be that we have to balance between, let's starve the folks who deploy the sensor network. It may be that they don't want to deploy a Bluetooth radio thing, and if they know that they're not going to get as much information from it, and it might not be worth it, and their budget is being cut at the same time, maybe we can just make it not worth their while to deploy the sensor network in the first place. So all of these things actually have an impact on each other, and they need to be worked on as part of a coherent package, I think.
So there's all. Go ahead.
So one of the other funny things about the centralized is not only that they have the mapping back, they are also the ones that give the keys to the phones. So they can even give you special keys if you're a special person of interest, that they don't even need to map back. They just can have this kind of thing, which makes it more problematic. But another thing that we don't talk enough, it's not only the manual contact tracing that will create these networks that they can be used in another way, but we observe, at least on this side of the ocean, more and more apps appearing to try to manage contact tracing in restaurants, in cinemas, right? In order to go to these places you register. And in the beginning, this was about, I'm going to have a list at the entrance of the restaurant where one person of the party could leave their phone. And now more and more we see these apps and even scan this QR code. And these are again creating more and more traces about who is where and when is whom, creating this network of surveillance that is even bigger. And if now we have this on the mall combined with the cameras, we start to have again more and more and more of these signals that come from the idea that we're going to protect health. But if we don't really look at many of those, and not only the contact tracing is just one example, but there are many, many more. The ecosystem is becoming brutal, and also we don't know how it works in the back. We don't know if all of these applications, each of them have a backend, or there is the one and only backend that will actually handle all of the information of every citizen that is reserved in a place somewhere, right? We're gonna get forced into do these things. And again, discrimination will be a question there, but there is a lot more that we need to think about how that is going to play a role and how technology is going to get invasive. And this goes back to the role of Google and Apple and how much of all of these will be actually under the control, because a lot of it is actually done on the phone.
I'm noticing an interesting pattern here where it comes down to how much you trust your government organizations, but it's not just generic social habits of trust. It's in particular how well does this integrate with the COVID coordination in general from the governments? Like in Singapore, I bet there's an actual health organization that actually tries to pay attention to how many people are sick and notice the ones that are and help other people. Whereas in the US, we basically left to deal with it on our own. So I could imagine the COVID tracing app in the US being a total failure because the COVID response is a total failure. So of course we don't trust them to get any of the other parts right. So why should we trust them here? So there's a question from the audience that I thought was interesting. I have a question about all the independent software and solutions that claim to support health authorities to forecast outbreaks by scraping big data and selling that to public agencies. Are GDPR and CCPA enough? The issue is the larger data aggregation and commodification of personal data.
My answer would be no. And that again, this week there was a report here in Switzerland that also pointed out that the fact that some of these other apps can listen to the exposure notification beacons and also collect them, so that then they could even sell them back to our own government, right? We remove this data from the government by creating an app so that the government deploys a privacy by design and a decentralized option, but now we also remove from them the ability to observe the pandemic and to observe the movements. So what now if these apps or all of these other systems that we're saying collect the data and then sell them back to the government? Like, have we even created a new business model out of this that we didn't know about? And I think this is a worry, right? At least we know here one app that is already doing that. It doesn't do the selling part. It does this in principle locally for the user. Just show to the user a bit more about how they have been interacting socially by means of listening to these beacons. But that is just like maybe the first of many of these. And I think this is a big worry. And I don't know if there is any law. I don't think here GDPR would actually be the thing to go to. I don't know if there is anything in the US that can.
We have a GDPR equivalent, sort of, but only in California. And like GDPR, it's a bit unclear what it will actually mean when people try to enforce it. So yeah, another topic that I've been pondering here, this ties back to the protest side of things. So at-risk communities in the US have already learned to regret answering when the government comes asking them questions. They've already learned not to answer census info because then you're telling people about your grandmother who really isn't supposed to be in that state or living with your lease or something like that. So they've learned not to answer when phone calls happen. Do we expect the same thing with COVID tracing? And is there any way around it other than going back in time and actually building that social trust that is required for governments to function and be trusted?
So we don't just think it's going to happen. We know that it's going to happen. We know we have experience in the states in the United States that have rolled out some level of manual contact tracing. They have seen very low uptake, and that may be for several reasons, right? One of them is almost certainly the historical legacy that you described, right? The reason why we need to have a functioning social support system is so that people can rely on it, and they don't feel with good justification. People don't feel they can rely on it. This is a struggle in all kinds of ways, and we won't go into the census discussion in detail here. But there are folks from marginalized communities who are really struggling. They want their communities represented on the census because they know they can be better funded if they are actually represented in the census. At the same time, you're asking individuals to take a serious risk for themselves or their families to participate. Those are really difficult trade-offs to put someone in a position to make. And we have a history in this country of misusing data that has been centrally gathered. Information from the census was used to round up Japanese Americans and intern them in camps in the 1940s. If we don't remember that history, we are at risk of repeating it. Maybe we're at risk of repeating it even if we do remember it. But another reason for this is that we don't have a public health infrastructure that's capable of doing manual contact tracing at the scale that we're talking about here. The contact tracing operations that we have tend to be small, tend to be targeted on either specific epidemics like HIV/AIDS, or on very narrowly targeted, like local foodborne illness outbreaks. And those don't have the same capacity as for a pandemic that is potentially society-wide, very rapid, casual infection. And we just don't have the teams to do that. And the result is that the health agencies that are actually trying to do something about it, which we need them to do it, they are hiring up new contact tracers. And contact tracing manually is, if you can get someone to even answer the phone, involves talking to them and explaining to them what the trade-offs are, explaining to them why they should engage with you. Like, if you don't speak their language, if you're not part of their community, if you're representing the same faceless bureaucracy that just denied them, government benefits or locked their cousin up, it's very difficult to convince people to open up and work with you. And so we see the costs of this lack of social trust and lack of trustworthiness in our ability to respond to this epidemic.
So it's interesting to point out the variety of ways that our system has failed us in the U.S. Because there are certainly people out there saying, "Oh, if only the U.S. government had acted, 2 weeks earlier, then all of this would have been different." And sure, the numbers would have been different, but fundamentally, the fact that we have no public health infrastructure that can scale to handle this and trust in it, and we have no law enforcement that actually makes us safer as a society. These are the underlying problems that lead to things like the COVID tracing apps. They're not going to have uptick here, we predict, because there's not the trust infrastructure to support them. That's an intriguing side. So I've got another question for, I guess, all three of you. What is your personal balance on being in the streets versus socially isolating, and why? Like, how do you make that choice?
Well, I think that when you're making that choice, it's a personal decision. For me, I'm a Black person. Black Lives Matter, and we have there's a momentum. There's like a lot of change happening in this moment. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to protest, but I'll wear my mask. I'll have my gloves. I'll be all PPE'd out. And I'm there with my community. I think if we had these things like the technology for contact tracing apps and exposure notification apps on a community level, right, where the trust is strong and the suspicion is low, and then you went from the community level up, you'd have a lot more uptake and a lot more people using it. The virus can't see your skin color. It just goes human to human. It's a great unifier. And at the end of the day, we're all in this together. You have a lot of control over your neighbor's health. And the problems in the US and the reason why we have such high numbers is because, we have a lot of work to do, like you said, Roger, Do
the other two of you have a?
Yeah, I mean, as Matt said, we are in a moment of historical potential. Whether we realize that potential depends on how much people can step up to what's required of them. Like Matt, when I go out to protests, I wear a face mask. I try to remain socially distant, and I'm not interested in taking unnecessary risks. At the same time, I do feel an obligation to take some level of risk. I'm a privileged person. I have the ability to sit back and pretend that none of this affects me. But I don't think that's an acceptable outcome, right? I mean, I think for our society to be a just one, we need to actually to make it move. And so I feel an obligation as someone who does have an amount of privilege to stand up and go ahead and put my body on the line. Again, an unnecessary risk, not worth it. But these are really critical and important changes, and I'm going to go ahead and try to take them in ways that can keep my community safe at the same time. Now, that does mean that I've thought carefully before I go out about what sorts of information, what sorts of digital tools I have on myself, about whether I'm protected in terms of both myself catching the virus and potentially transmitting it, since you don't know whether you're transmitting it or not. And in terms of talking with with the folks that I'm protesting with, and with the folks that may be on the opposite side as well, like engaging with people and letting them, helping people think through how we take these risks in a way that advances what we want, the changes that we want to see in society, I think is really critically important.
Carmela, how do you see this from the Switzerland side? Are there protests there?
On the Switzerland side, there are very little protests. Like Switzerland is not a country very famous for protesting. They're very ordered, They don't do this kind of things. And on that side, there is very little we can do in that sense. But yeah, I do go out the minimal possible and with a mask every time that we're on public transport, so as to endanger the least possible anyone else.
Makes sense. Speaking of the masks, so when I am out in the streets here with my 500 or 1,000 closest friends, we're all wearing masks, but the cops aren't. So, I mean, yeah, there's the risk of I'm going to go hang out with some other people and we're going to wear masks and we're going to think through the risks and we're going to try to make sure that we end up safe. But the system, the police, the organizations that we're protesting against don't seem to care about our safety. They're not wearing masks, and then they I mean, tear gas, kettling tactics, putting people in holding cells or leaving them in the bus that's supposed to bring them to the holding cell all at once, tearing off their masks and pepper spraying them. So how do we balance the risks that we can control with the fact that the system, the police, are introducing more risks to us?
Yeah, I mean, when I go to protest, there's a common chant which is like, "Where's your mask?" So I mean, it is kind of frightening when people we're supposed to look to say, "Look, I'm upholding the law. This is what it looks like," are completely doing the opposite. But I think, what we end up doing is looking upon each other and building our own safety nets and our own security nets, right?
I think there's a real question that lurks at the heart of much of this, which is how do we hold the police accountable? It is very difficult in the legal environment currently in the United States to hold a police officer accountable for failures in their line of work. And their line of work is ostensibly to be a public safety officer. And not wearing a mask, I think a lot of people have thought about masks as a form of protecting yourself so you don't catch the virus. But masks are equally important to protect other people. And for a public safety officer to not wear a mask, in addition to being a bad example, if they happen to be infected, they are actively putting other people at risk, right? And we see this time and again with a police officer who, runs someone down with their car, or the police officer who harms someone during the course of an arrest. They're typically not held accountable. And so there's an overall question of police accountability here. And, not wearing their masks is maybe the least abusive thing that I've seen police officers do. But if you want to start talking about how should we address that? Well, again, the police need to be answerable to the citizenry, and they're currently not. So we need to look at measures that can limit that. So in New York State, we had a law called 50A that made it so that police disciplinary measures are hidden from the public. Now, I'm a privacy advocate, and 50A was framed initially as a privacy concern. This is a private personnel matter. We shouldn't necessarily report on that. But the privacy of someone who is extremely powerful and potentially abusive and documented to be abusive doesn't hold much weight with me when it's looking at the balance of the public health and the safety. So we've managed to repeal 50A, which is good. And again, I'm sure that there are other situations around the country and around the world. But really, we need to be looking into questions about police accountability. There's a doctrine called qualified immunity. We won't need to get into it in detail here, but it basically gives the courts the ability to waive off misbehavior and liability for misbehavior from police officers in the course of doing their jobs, and that needs to end as well.
And we, in addition to that, have the police union problem where basically the agreements that they have prevent the police departments from firing people who've had legitimate complaints filed against them over and over. So it's not just a question of knowing whether these are bad cops. It's a question of what you can even do about them. So I'm trying to picture a world where we have this COVID tracing app and the police have a policy saying that they must install the COVID tracing app when they're outside. That seems like a very strange world that we won't arrive in. Or the police have a policy saying they refuse to use the app because they don't want to put their privacy at risk, and they can claim, we're more important than keeping society safe. So,
well, I mean, you actually see this particular conflict in some of the bizarre theories around police misbehavior in the U.S. So I don't know if you saw the protester who was shoved to the ground by 2 police officers, cracked his skull and was bleeding. That protester was accused of being trying to surveil the police. That supposedly he had a scanner in his hand and was trying to either scan or jam police communications equipment. So there's a whole bunch of very strange sort of it's almost projection of like, what are they trying to do? Right? We know that the police do use stingrays, right? We know that the police to monitor people's communications. We know that the police search people's phones. For them to turn around and say, well, we were justified in pushing this guy to the ground because we think he was trying to scan our communications equipment, when they're supposed to be working for the public, is a very strange turnabout. And we need to keep calling them on that.
Yeah, how can we do our job if you're trying to keep us accountable? And the follow-up is, what is your job exactly, and what should your job be? That's the discussion we should all be having. So we're close to the hour mark. I'm going to ask one more question for each of the 3 of you, and then figure out where we go from there. So where do we go from here? The vaccine is months or more away. Maintaining protests a couple weeks ago, there were like 30,000 people out in the streets, and now there are maybe thousands, which is still a lot. But how do you maintain the momentum, especially as we imagine the second wave of COVID hits in the winter when things get bad again? And it's all, the first wave is far from over in many cities around the US. So how do we balance this? Where does it go? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What's next?
I'm optimistic. I have to be. And I think, like to Carmela's point, being outside, you have a less likely chance of being exposed to these viral particles, right? So you're going to get a smaller viral load. You can wear PPE. If you're going to go out, you just have to be smart about it. And also, really ask yourself, like, is the best thing for me to be doing marching right now or being in a crowd right now? Maybe I can use resources that I have, skills that I have, other things to, partake in these protests another way.
I think another point here that is just that we have a duty of self-care as well. The momentum is important, and we need to be able to keep it up and sustain it. And if we go out and throw ourselves into everything the moment that it comes up, you will eventually burn out and be unable to keep it going. So taking care of yourself is really important, following the guidance that Matt describes, and going out when you can and checking in with the people that you care about, with other people who are your allies, making sure you can support them so that they're prepared to go out as well. These are all really important things to keep the pressure up. We're making more progress than I expected us to make, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do.
Carmela, do you have any thoughts on where the world should go and whether we're going to get there?
My thoughts are that the second wave will likely come eventually, and that on that sense, kind of learning whether these apps could be useful or not, and trying to find out more about how we can protect society without doing this lockdown again. That's actually very bad for everyone. While at the same time, as Matt and DKG said, being able to still exercise our societal rights and our rights as people, right? Because the other danger of all of this is that we just get so used to be told what we do. And we should not forget that that is not a right anybody has. And there is a lot we can do in that sense.
I also wanted to put a call out, if I can, just before we wrap up. I know that the people listening to this conversation are people who know about what Tor is, but I just want to point out that there are very few people doing the kind of work that Carmela is doing, and I'm super grateful that she's doing what she can. We need more people to be looking at the details of how these systems actually work and being able to highlight the specific concerns that are out there. Carmela, we can't just all lean on your expertise. And so if there are folks who are out here who are listening to this, who are interested in questions about privacy by design, and maybe don't want to work on internet protocols. This is another example of privacy by design and privacy preserving technologies that really will have an impact. And it may mean that you find a better way to do it. It may mean that you find flaws and problems that mean that we need to tear the systems down, but we need more people looking at it. And so I hope that some of the people who are watching this, who are wondering, what can I do, will think about that as one of the things that they can do as well.
And a lot of more questions, right? Like this technology is being deployed, there needs to be a lot of oversight and a lot of many questions. And as annoying when you're on the design side, so sometimes this may be, it's actually very helpful and very important for people to realize and understand. And one thing that I have to say again is that this change from decentralized applications to the decentralized, it happened because there were people looking at this and there were people that did a push. And this was not only a technological push on our side, but also a lot of civil society that stepped up, like the change that happened in Germany, CCC, and many others just said, no, this is not going to happen. And this is very, very important. It's very important both from the side that civil society has to push, but technologies, we have to give them the tools to push. The only way we could actually say no to a centralized system is because we had a decentralized one designed and ready, so they could not say no. And this is something that we can do even in a place where there are no protests and where I cannot leave this room, but I can still do a lot for design and a lot for communications and transparency and explaining to people what is happening and how technology can be harmful so that they can step up and say no.
Matt, do you want to throw in a call for action? We've just gotten to. Is there a specific thing that you wish our audience would focus more on?
Yeah, I would say find out where your legislature is, wherever you are, on surveillance actions by police and how transparent that is. Obviously wear your mask. I know there's a lot of information out there, a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of whatever alternative viewpoints out there. Just wear your mask. If you don't believe in it, don't worry, just wear it anyway. It's not going to kill you. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to this moment that we're in, at least globally, looking at police budgeting and police violence and brutality, there's a group called the Movement for Black Lives. It's 150 organizations looking out for racial justice. The website is the 4bl.org. Just check it out. And just be careful, take care of each other. That's how we win.
Awesome. Thank you. So this was our first PrivChat. I'm going to cover three follow-up topics, and then we'll let you go. So this was our first PrivChat, and it's not going to be the last. So expect another one this summer, and figure out what you want us to be talking about. What are the timely topics? What are the cool things that we should do our next PrivChat about? There's the hashtag PrivChat with Tor that you can let us know, and there are all sorts of other ways of reaching us. So think about what you want to hear about. The second one, there's a conference happening in the middle of July called the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Symposium, or PETS. You can find it at petsymposium.org. And if you find these topics on the intersection between privacy preserving algorithms and society interesting, then there are a lot of other people at PETS who also find them interesting and are trying to work on good solutions for that sort of thing. So while you're waiting for the next PrivChat, this coming PETS will be virtual, so anybody from around the world can be there, and there are stipends available to make it quite cheap to attend. And then as the last point, if you enjoyed what we were talking about today, or you like Tor, please consider becoming a monthly donor for Tor. Any amount matters. The more, basically having reliable gifts allows us to have stability in terms of predictable income and in terms of flexible and unrestricted funding that lets us focus on the things that are most important. And if you become a monthly donor, we will put you on the pedestal, on the tier called Defenders of Privacy, that includes sending you cool gifts in the mail, like the Defenders of Privacy patch that you will get to learn what it looks like when you get yours. So with that, thank you to all three of you, and thank you to Gus and Al and Antonella and Isabella and other folks on the back end who are making all this actually work. And we'll see you at the next PrivChat. Thank you.